there's a choice between two presentations on the contemporary, a text, reading a text on the contemporary, a polemic, and a PowerPoint, which is 3 years ago, PowerPoint. So it's a bit, I was wondering whether or not we should do a text. What's the consensus? We could do there's a PowerPoint, which has obviously got images and there's the whole presentation itself, or the essay on the contemporary.
I like the idea of the more recent one.
It's not. There's not none of them more recent.
I mean,
The polemic. I thought you were saying the polemic.
Yeah, but it's got some. It's 3 years old, I think, or maybe even more.
but that's
They're
not a
all pretty
problem
timeless.
necessarily.
So whatever you feel like.
Let's start off with the PowerPoint. Well, let's do the text. Let's do the text. Share the screen. And what we'll do is stop at any point. I think it'll give us a chance to break into a text. So, Sharon, you start to read.
Sure. The new is the longing for the new, not the new itself. This is the curse of everything new, the Adorno aesthetic theory. The aesthetic life of the Greeks had already essentially prompted a memory of the future. The contemporary is the timely of the new. It is the appearance on time of what is in time. In this regard, it folds or is the fold of itself, passing through itself and over itself in order that it can return to itself as the self-same. Repetition is figured within this motion. The contemporary of the end spacing of modernity, a mode then of modernity bereft of the coding that underlay modernity. As opposed to circulating around distinct memory forms of modernity, it resides within oblivion. The contemporary passage is the occasioning of oblivion over memory. What surfaces in this is a fear of the future. There is no turning back and no looking forward, because memory is thin, and so then is imaginative recoil. A post-human schema stalks the very imaginary called the future. Jean-Luc Nancy claims in his book, The Sense of the World, that there is no longer any world, and hence there any history whose tribunal one could stand. Alain Badiou describes this condition as a form of wordlessness, a condition that is an outcome of the process of globalization. Scratch the surface of any individual psyche, and out pops phrases such as everything is running on empty. We are running out of time and options. It's getting impossible to breathe. My nerve endings are being burnt by the stress of it all, and thousands of other micro-narratives, pathologies of the instant that led back to the implosion of macro-narratives. The contemporary is the pathology of the instant floating in the sea of nihility. In this sense, it both engages on an intensive level whilst emptying out on another. The intensive and the inert are the very push and pull of the present. The gestalt of figure ground is dissolved or fragmented into this. The gestures of limit experience cannot lead to an outside, but are contained within an immersion without the dialectic of inside and outside.
Just the last one.
Sure. The contemporary is the emptying out of modernity and points towards a suspended void that figures the future. We continue with it because there is nothing to end, because it has emptied out the very content in which a will is formed to enact ending. The vitality of modernity was in part predicated upon the notion of the end of art and the speculation of yet to come as dually figured mode of anticipation. Rather than such a figure of anticipation, a dialectical push and pull, we have instead a circulation and suspension without foundation. In simple terms, the energetics that would produce a marking that figures a full stop is lacking. Avant-garde gestural, cultural gesture ceased because the forces it assembled carried risk or metaphorical throwing of the dice. There is risk because the potentiality of destination is in the air. But if anything is in circulation, then a dulling rhythm of repetition is what dictates the reality principle of art. It is this factor that allows art to be an adjunct of the economy.
So let's stop there and go over that. Any thoughts, any objections, any additions?
So, in your account, or this account, you seem to be saying that the contemporary or the present or whatever, however we describe it, emerges from the abyss, maybe, and it seems to not have come out of some type of extension, but it's coming out of some intensive form. But it sounds very Deleuzian. Is that the way you see it? Whereas
Deleuzian.
maybe those philosophers were influencing. It's an interesting conception of time. But is this a conception of time that I was interested how it relates to, say, the conception of time that Kant would put forward, which would be grounded in a different. I mean, I think Deleuzian time would be kind of ungrounded, in a disjunctive space, whereas Kant would certainly be grounded and grounded.
I mean, Kant enables the idea of the subjective turn to occur and no ability to occur through that turn.
Yeah.
Whereas this is bereft of such a kind of dialectical relationship between figure and ground. So it's dissolution of figure ground, dissolution of a gestalt, and with it a kind of fracturing of temporality.
Yeah, I mean, I think in that idea, the idea of of time emerging prior to the subject, prior to the object. So Lewis would say an account of the genesis of time, rather presupposing it is what, and there he comes to the idea that it might come from the abyss, emerge from the abyss.
I mean, you can say we went from a very definite idea of temporality within modernity, where it seemed to be going somewhere, and it seemed to be based on a series of negations. And the contemporary just drifts backwards and forwards and circulates without any recall to a schema. Already Badiou said that there's no fundamental schema in modernity itself. That modernity was always in search of a schema, but the contemporary is even less grounded in any temporal figure.
I was just thinking then about Fabiano's sort of suggestion in terms of the exhibition idea, the alternate airport. I was just sort of thinking, so it feels like there's something going on of like the holding pattern, like airplanes do. They, you just sort of sweep around and round, waiting for somewhere to go.
I mean, it's a sort of non-Platon airport. You don't know quite. It kind of induces a sort of spaciousness. It's gone. Lester, could you read?
Sure. Am I off mute? Yes. So
Paradigmatic.
the paradigmatic figure of contemporary art is Andy Warhol because of his embrace of forgetfulness and his enthusiasm of business. Absolute indifference mixed with a form of absolute subjectification, a self-possession in the grip of dissolution through which it emerges. This is, in fact, the unity of self-possession passing into self-loss, and on the level of the work itself, a unity of excess and meaningless economy of detachment. If we travel back to the 1970s, the figure of Joseph Beuys appeared to hold the prevailing mantle of postmodernist emblem, but his case was much too convoluted to become an icon of contemporary art because of his various attempts to evacuate memory. Beuys simply lacked transparency, whereas Warhol was able to be seen for what he was, which is a blank screen onto which anything might be written. Clearly, what was being composed was the vanishing point of culture as opposed to its potential turn into new modes of engagement. Whereas Beuys presented the complexity of figuring, Warhol produced the simplification of the image reduced to the shine of a single color. Silver Marilyn, or Silver Marlin Brando, I guess. Silver Marilyn, Pink Marilyn. Warhol is now in step with his time. He is Electric Andy. Within the contemporary passage, art has moved to the center of the economy. Art is displayed as the triumph of this ubiquity or circulation of passage. It signifies in this sense the certainty that all of social and creative life is subject to commodification. The contemporary contains the rhetoric of everything. The rhetoric of everything is art, but equally it matters little that this might be the case. What is the importance? What are the importance, though, are strategies. Which wall or floor it sits on, and what price it might fetch in the near future. Contemporary art has become a staging process, especially the staging of personality, which is displayed as a sign of pure mutability. The contemporary passage answers structuralism's death of the author by inflating the restaging of a cult of personality above all prevailing content. It asks only that we might understand art through absorption with the fetishism of the persona out of which it emerges. Thus, to make art is to play upon the persona which authorizes it as such. The transpersonal modernist gesture contained within the found object becomes the site of the personal election of the ascent of the power through which art is meant to arise. Contemporary culture restages modernity constantly as an object of fascination. Part of this fascination is modernity's ambivalence towards tradition and memory. If under the sign of modernity the world never stood still, then tradition was still the ground it pressed against in order to achieve traction. Modernity was thus able to splice different temporal registers in order to produce novel syntaxical frameworks. To propose a post-contemporary is to open out passages of tradition in order to reconfigure both memory and syntactical reserve in ways that do not simply echo modernity. This is not simply born out of a desire for another ground, but a reconfiguration of temporality outside of modernity and certainly outside of the contemporary construct.
So stop there. Any comments or? I mean, part of how it arose is I felt within the Royal College that there was a very casual embrace of the contemporary. You know, they often said, "Where's the contemporary in this?" or "Where's the relationship to, in research? Where's the relationship to contemporary art?" There's a kind of insistence. There's got to have a contemporary address to it without ever really working out what the contemporary was or what it kind of signified. And it was as if it was a permanent inscription of the word contemporary. So you get courses which are obviously, like CAP is the insertion of the contemporary. So as if the Royal College was formerly modernist and craft-based, suddenly it becomes also contemporary, without working out what that could imply. So we get a coexistence of the contemporary and the modern.
I love the sentence. It seems to be quite a damning one, though, that it's the vanishing point of culture. That's a really strong thought.
And if it's true, we wouldn't call courses contemporary, would we?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and Molly's got her hand up, or had her hand up there. And she's on mute, though.
Sorry, I was saying just forgive the extra sound effects. I was very interested in the Beuys versus Warhol comparison, because I found that, I mean, Beuys was himself like a very, let's say, crinkled surface onto which his art was reflected due to his own personal life, the trauma he's experienced, and his life was very rich in comparison to Warhol, that was kind of like a shiny car that was taken out of its package. But it made me think of Warhol post Valerie Solanas, i.e. after he was shot and had to wear a surgical corset for the rest of his life, because he was completely scarred to the point that his art was completely changed and he never was the same person. And he, after that point, referred to death in a different way, referred to shiny, like contemporary symbols of modern art, such as Marlon Marilyn, in a different way. He started drawing skulls, and I think he kind of, I found a quote as we were speaking that was very interesting. He said, Warhol quote, "I said that I wasn't creative since I was shot, because after that I stopped seeing creepy people." So I think his whole outlook has changed in a way that made this essay much more personal to me. Like if you look through these two as a sort of two different aisles to walk down, in a way.
Now, I was referring to the post-Battery period, really.
Was that the post Valerie Solanas?
Post-Battery, so it closed the factory down and went uptown and became business art. And, you know, kind of evoked the idea that he had no memory, which maybe had a personal inflection as much as an intellectual claim.
It's interesting to see the transformation of both artists through a violent event, but it feels like they swap like the transformation that Beuys claims to have gone through, and then Warhol. I think you could make a parallel if you invert the two.
I think as well. I think to a certain extent, Beuys kind of created this, invented an image, and then made himself.
Well, certainly his stories, no one takes them seriously now.
Well, I don't think that's true. They were myths. I mean, and also, you know, in the early days, right, he was attracting attention. You know, he would get thumped and hurt and cut in fights when he was presenting things that were not popular, and that made him famous. Right? He was actually attracting that type of attention in the same way that, well, not in the same way. Warhol was observing that time, creating that type of attention in others, but they're kind of related in the sense. I think they all just knew each other well, right? I remember looking at. They
kind of tended to.
I saw an image that Warhol had done that with him, right? They'd exchanged work, I remember. I don't think they're so far away from each other. Maybe they are in their image.
But if you look at there's a show at Rotex Gallery of drawings by boys. They almost disappear. Whereas the last thing which happens to Warhol is that they disappear. They're glistening, shiny icons. So they've gone up as an aesthetic.
Yeah, I agree. But I mean, when he was pissing on the what is it? Pissing on the metal, in a way, well, that's not so different from Boyle. Aesthetic.
Who wants to read? Molly, you've got a good reading voice.
I can read, but I've got a toddler eating in the background, so I don't know if you want the disturbance.
Disturbance is all right. It might give some texture to the event.
Okay, so are we at the heart?
Yeah.
At the heart of any move towards defining the difference between the contemporary and the post-phase proposed, circles around the combining elements of poetics and politics formed within a matrix defining aesthetic communities. The question embedded within a resistance to the presence is the free play of energetics, therapeutics, cognition, and aesthetic intensities. In turn, this free play opens out the relationship between the presentation of freedom and the autonomy of the work. The contemporary is in itself a form of disorientation. Bernard Stiegler states, in the current globalization, the Occident is in the process of disappearing. There will no longer be an Orient. It has been disorientated, and that which fabricated the Orient, which never was the Occident, is also disorientated in its own fashion, and quite brutally. Disorientation relates to the notion of time being out of joint. This conjunction is the basis of another time, but one that is difficult to comprehend from the standpoint of the present or from the logical progression of the past. This aligns the future with the unknown or what can be invented. Disorientation relates in turn to the idea of the untimely or being against the grain. What history gives us is the possibility of being untimely, of placing ourselves outside constraints, the limitations and blinkers of the present. This is precisely what it means to write for a future that present cannot recognize, to develop, to cultivate the untimely, the out of place and the out of step. This access to the out of step can come only from the past and in certain uncomfortableness, a disease in the present.
More
are in the intersection of the experience of that which we might dread in regard to the future has already occurred. In his book, The Writing of the Disaster, Maurice Blanchot, The Disaster, is without conclusion, and as such is not apocalyptic, but rather leaves us with a wild, unnarratable history without any meaning in the present. In part, the disaster is a form of interruption, preventing the transition of past into future, because nothing can follow from it, because it is impossible, a limit experience or a draining of subjective apprehension. As impossibility, there is nothing that takes place beyond it. It leads to no alternative, as is the case with the dialectic. Rather, it is survival without a different future. Last one. Seeing the future or a future was an essential part of the intellectual and sensible part of modernity. This provided a horizon, and with this, a perspective. Having a future was thus coextensive with having a place within culture. Without this, the culture is, or would be, blinded of anticipation.
Thank you. Any comments, any thoughts?
So, Jonathan, do you think the fact of, I think you mentioned up in here, time is out of joint, is that particularly something that's with the contemporary, or could you say that's in modernity as well?
was late modernity as a principal figure, but it sort of extended into the contemporary.
And outside of Shakespeare, who was the philosophers, one of the more recent ones that took up that theme of time being out of joint?
Derrida.
Derrida, yeah, thank you.
In his book Spectres of Marx, which is a kind of revision of modernity. He claims that Marx repeats, but doesn't repeat in a way that is, in a way, modernist. So it's spectral.
Deleuze also brings it up in the difference of repetition. Right.
Repetition. Would like to take on the last part, difficult reading?
I can read.
Go
To
on.
see what is coming denotes at once the visibility and the invisibility of whatever comes. The future is not absolutely invisible, a subject of pure transcendence objecting to any anticipation at all, to any knowledge, to any speech. Nor is the future absolutely visible, an object clearly and absolutely foreseen. It frustrates any anticipation by its precipitation, its power to surprise. To see what is coming thus means to see without seeing, await without awaiting. A future which is neither present to the gaze nor hidden from it. For Malabo, there is the arrangement of two temporalities, technology and alienation, that determine the future, and the arrangement of these two times determines the future of those creatures who no longer have time ahead of themselves, who leave out a teleology, which is shattered because it is already accomplished. Such a future is both beautiful and terrible. Beautiful because everything can still happen, terrible because everything has already happened. Whereas modernity proper was a projection. In the words of Peter Osborne, of a present of permanent transition, forever reaching beyond itself, the contemporary fixes or enfolds such transitoriness within the duration of conjecture, or at its most extreme, the stasis of a present moment. The question is to what extent this reality of permanent transition can be sustained as a condition of culture. For it to be sustained implies modes of oblivion as a rule, or in more directly political terms, a dictatorship of nihility. This is why the question of the future is so perplexing, for it appears it is without a ground to think of a schema in order to form an image or idea. It appears that the very circularity of contemporary temporality is based not only on the fragmented memory of modernism's formations, but equally on the progressive erasure of memory. It is not that oblivion and memory move together within the same circular motion, but that a chaotic principle is introduced into this dynamic. Suspension of time is not just a model or schema of temporality, but progressivization of the functions related to time. The various wars The various wars staged within the modernist period had definite designs and outcomes. They drew distinct lines of encounter and followed strategies. Contemporary wars, such as those fought in Syria, appear to exist with spatial and temporal demarcations, but equally work to destroy such demarcations. On the surface, it is a war staged within a territory, but it is a war of many directions and assembly of forces that outcomes can no longer be calculated. When one territory is erased, then the logic of such a scenario is that the war will simply shift location or change its face. What is clear is that there is no ground from which an outcome can clearly be defined, other than the spectacle of ruination. If a culture is defined by the sense of a collective memory body being formed, then what is erased is the possibility of sustaining this memory body. Obviously, this scenario takes place at the limit of the contemporary situation, but it is certainly not a state of expectation or on the outside. Rather, logic prevails that is in keeping with the dynamics of contemporary temporality.
Yes, for that, it's a very dense piece of text, so brave reading.
So is this erasure of memory I'm just trying to get my head around it. Is it what you're saying is that because we're experiencing things repeatedly from different perspectives, that we lose a sense of what our memory of it is, or the memory? I mean, a lot of this stuff we're not experiencing ourselves anyway. We're just being given a perspective. Is that what you're talking about? Have I got this wrong?
I think that's one way of looking at it, yes.
I mean, the text recalls to me, and I can't remember from where it is exactly, but an Ernest Hemingway quote in one of his books, and it was something like, for like 2 paragraphs, the now, nothing but the now is the now, and just everything before gets erased to become in the present. And I guess that's what you're saying here with the contemporary, that just it's an ongoing thing that erases its past, because that's not relevant to the contemporary.
Is there also some Marxism in there? Not.
Sorry, say it again?
Is there also something to do with the annihilation of space-time going on here, which is, I guess, so Marx would say what would say of society, as time moves at ever faster speeds, and the contemporary become.
For memory to occur, you need spacing, and fairly measured spacing, and if spacing gets congested or disappears, and there's no place or space for memory to circulate.
Well, that's certainly something that a condition that follows from the digital to a certain extent. Space and time get compressed ever and ever smaller slices and disappear.
And we in turn are mined by data. So it's the last stage of mining of the earth, is mining individuals for their data, anticipating the moves of individuals by their data. So the data moves in advance of you. It's already waiting for you. So in that sense, you don't have a future, you have data which replaces it. I mean, with the recent political changes, the Brexit referendum, it was as if no one really understood this new mining of data which could occur. This where people were being fed information which was almost individually tempered for themselves, So they felt that the world was affirming their viewpoint because they got fed data which was amplifying that viewpoint.
So you just end up in a loop, a self-feeding loop that just goes around and around, feeding itself, telling you the same thing you want to see, the same thing you want to learn, the same thing you know.
But you still hang on to the idea that you're individual and you've got power. So it's sort of, you hang on to a modern sense of autonomy of the self.
But that structural framework that we were talking about with modernity just has dropped away, basically, without us realizing the floor's fallen away.
Yeah, so we don't understand any longer what the modern is.
Yeah, I mean, you present it as if it's then somehow reaches some equilibrium, but doesn't it just keep accelerating away to ever thinner time, to thinner reality, ever more ungrounded?
Well, we've definitely had a change in the last 3 years. I mean, I question whether we're still in the contemporary. I think another condition is taking hold of us, which I've called post-contemporary, but there's not a name for it.
I was talking to someone today about sort of, you know, the state of sort of music today. This sort of idea of loops and things coming back, because, you know, sort of since, I suppose you could say that sort of the 80s was the birth of sampling. And, you know, like, was it Beyonce's last album? She was sort of called out because she was sort of sampled lots of stuff and she didn't announce it. But what struck me about that was she was sampling tracks that were themselves made of samples. And there's something kind of going on here, and that's, you know, sort of, we're sort of, I don't know, can't try and express this, but it's like, yeah, like certainly in terms of music, it feels like there's sort of, where do you go?
Like itself, it doubles back, it loops.
Yeah, but it's at the same time, because we're now sampling the samples, you know, these sort of loops back to take from the past to bring into the future, getting tighter and tighter. It feels like this, you know, I don't know, it's like in physics, you'd think about like sort of like, you know, like the sort of the collapse of a star into, you know, a black hole or something. It's like this it's getting denser and tighter and smaller all the time. And I suppose, you know, within that there's an increase in energy and stuff, but it's got to go, so something's got to change, but it's like, how does that happen? Because fundamentally there isn't the sort of the fuel in terms of music to perpetuate it anymore.
It reminds me of Rene Tom's catastrophe theory. Like entropic systems like self-replicate until I think there's dysentropy at the end of that theory, like Salvin, after the sort of like after the annihilation.
Anyway, let's continue. Would you like to read?
Me?
Yeah.
Me.
Before we get back to it, can I just say I find I think, you know, if you think about something like this, you know, AI chat GBT, whatever it's called, you know, app of just essentially remining the internet and regurgitating it, then I can draw parallels to what's being said here. But I think it's also unnecessarily bleak to present that as the defining moment of our times. It's, you know, one offshoot of capitalism, but I feel that there's much more going on, and I don't feel that we only have the opportunity now to regurgitate and recircle the past at all. You know, I think that at the same time as opportunities have narrowed, they've also widened considerably, and I think we risk falling into a trap where we just look at it negatively, which I don't find overall helpful.
I think it it's a condition we have to deal with. But it's hard to deny that it exists. So,
but it's a factor. It's not. It doesn't mean that it defines the entire age. You know, I think that's a different thing to say.
I think there's another aspect to it, right? If this is the condition that we're confronted with on our daily lives, then how do you step out of that condition, temporarily or momentarily or whenever you like? You
or just
step
by
out.
switching off the internet. It's not actually. That's, I guess, what I'm saying is like, you know, it's almost like this is concluding that all is lost, and that, you know, I mean, we might as well just give up now if this is really
not the thesis,
the answer, right? And I just don't think that that's true. I just don't think that's remotely true.
It's not the thesis that I'm saying. I'm saying that we're probably at the end of the contemporary period or the contemporary interruption, and that we've got the opportunity to reconfigure the future if we take hold of what's at stake with it. So it is bleak in certain ways in tone, but it's also saying there is a paradigmatic shift which is possible to intervene within.
Exactly, and that's what I think, that, you know, the same dismantling of coherence and linearity and order that is, you know, producing just a regurgitation of stuff and data that's, you know, has no depth or meaning to it. That very same, you know, destruction of coherence is like, has an enormously liberating potential to remove the idea that anything has to be structured any particular way, you know. And I think that, you know,
I think what kind of maybe is happening, because we're in this digital age, and the digital, we mistake it for something that is not just a mirror. We mistake it for something more, but actually it's just a mirror of our condition. So essentially that feedback loop, you know, it's going to go back and forward unless we look away from it and to something that is other than a mirror, you know. But expecting the digital to provide us with anything other than the input that is given to it, it's always going to do what it does and fractalize the information. I think Blake was referring to fractalization when he was talking about, you know, the sort of sampling the sample. It's a sort of ever decreasing detail, isn't it? Fractal system.
I feel the paragraph ended in the logic is very, very logic. So also in the digital world, it's still very easy to forget everything, although there's data, but there's a lot of jobs that is based on how you can crawl out those data for like digging out what is the data that they need. I feel the development of technology is really similar with how human being learn stuff, and it's still very easy to be forgotten and still very difficult to be memorized, and what is memorized is still based on the logic. Yeah.
Can I just say something slightly irrelevant?
You certainly can.
Sorry. Because unfortunately I have to go, and we talked about next week being in my studio. Just wanted to throw that in there and say that, you know, we were going to have a candlelit session with Jonathan. If anyone wants to come, please let me know. That's all.
Coming.
Okay.
See you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
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 and can I just add a completely random comment as well, or off-topic comment? Teresa, your English has become amazing. Like, wow. I mean, we met on the graduate diploma, you know, I've read like 3 years of watching that grow. But oh my God, like amazing. Well done.
Thank you.
What the most difficult part of the text?
Mm.
You went and just dived into it. Whoosh.
I still have some words that I'm not sure, but mostly I can get the meaning.
Yeah.
And I
really
search
amazing.
during the reading. Yeah. Thanks.
So to go on from Jessica's kind of like, let's not all doom and gloom, are we looking as a way of moving out of this space for some sort of points of traction? Is that what we're trying to identify as artists, as cultural sort of contributors, to find those, to reestablish frameworks, reestablish points of traction to actually help, you know, sort of move forward with the practice?
I think what it's saying is that you've got to, in some way, take on the apparatus. You've got to kind of look at the paradigmatic structure and move accordingly.
Mm.
So it really wasn't, it's not, in that sense, pessimistic. It's looking for a rupture which invites possibility. I mean, it just is an assault, though, against a too casual definition of we're in contemporary time, and that's all there is to it.
Can I say something?
Yeah, go on.
I think that the example that you give a few rows down about A Ballad of a Thin Man kind of makes it very clear for me in terms of when I don't know if anyone here saw the Todd Haynes film about Bob Dylan, but there's a scene there because in this film, Being There, I think it's called, there are 6 different actors as Bob Dylan throughout his life. And there's a part that there's like literally a strip of Bob Dylan walking down the street. And I think it's Ballad of a Thin Man, which is another band singing anyway. And I think that this kind of visual paragraph is almost that repetition as well as the song, because the song is quite a repetition within itself. And it talks about a critic that tries to read into the future, he tries to kind of understand what is happening and by being critical and attacking the now. But there is no such thing as knowing what the now will bring or what the now really is. And when you see that visual sequence of the way that the characters keep appearing, but Bob Dylan keeps walking, it's almost like a kind of musical box, like a kind of, it could continue, it could just spin around and repeat the same cycle, but the characters will change, the scenarios will change, so will the notes. So it's kind of like a well-known structure in which everything else, including the details, will change. And that's why we can't really know. The critic will never know which is Mr. Jones, neither will we, but we just have to keep living in the now and the contemporary, I suppose.
Do you think as soon as we name it, then it loses authenticity as well, and it becomes kind of like it dissolves immediately? Like if we know it, then we kind of become...
Yeah, for me, I think it's about accepting that you cannot know it. I think for me, it's about letting go of the attempt to know or to impose or to find a trajectory. It is to embrace the absence of one. Yeah,
that's sort of what I mean, and what in essence is what I'm saying. Like, well, the critic always wants to know it and name it, right? That's what the critic is, or that's that side of things. But as a creative, you need to not know it, because that's the limitless point of creation, isn't it? That's the moment where nothing is defined, so everything is possible.
I agree.
And I think the trick is to to embrace that unknowability not as a threat or a decline or a disintegration, but as a source of liberation in itself. I think there's an understandable tendency, given our long-held desire to be and feel in control, and like we know, like we're getting somewhere, like we could ever know it all, that we're nearly there and we've nearly mapped it all out, to an embrace of the fact that that's utterly impossible. And how would you act then? How would you act then in positivity, in celebration, in confidence, respecting the fact that you cannot know, rather than looking for another means to put down markers which are never going to be representative of the truth?
I mean, that's one of the definitions of finitude, is that we can't get to know. I mean, in Kant, there's this idea that we can't have total knowledge.
And I think that that's where, science is, pointing to now, that, that we are coming across observations that, are not just weird, but unknowable to us, given our dimensional form and organization of perception, that there is a great deal that is simply beyond our reach. And we may be able to imagine or speculate, but that should never be confused with being able to know. And I don't know, I don't see that as bleak. I see that as a release.
I don't think it's necessarily, it's not necessarily bleak generally. It's just the situation we're in. I think it just feels like we're in this position, but it will change. We just don't know how to escape it yet.
Maybe it's not about escaping it. I think maybe that's the point I'm trying to make. I'm not sure it is about escaping it so much as actually embracing it, like letting go of the idea that there's a need to escape it. I suspect might be the fundamental step that needs to be taken.
You've been.
It feels like
very zen. Dropping away of body and mind.
Well, it is that, knowing is, surely knowing isn't just in the mind anyway, is it? It's all sorts of things, and different, belief systems have different versions of what knowing is. So, are we talking science-based? Are we talking, if everything's based on science, that's, rational way of knowing. But surely there are other systems of belief and knowing.
Shall we just move on a little bit more, and then we'll get to some point, maybe? Would you like to read?
I can read.
Okay.
Where are we going from? The words of a ballad. Yeah. The words of pardon me. The words of A Ballad of a Thin Man by Bob Dylan are emblematic of modernist time, breaking up but also anticipating yet another time to come. Something's happening, but you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? Psychologically, the temporality of contemporary time works to produce the figure of a double bind. Within this condition of a generalized double bind, nothing ever happens to settle, and yet the feeling that is generated is of being trapped. This is a feeling that cannot be resolved or even clearly recognized, because at its root, it eats away at coherence in ways that destroys the very possibility of picture being formed. The idea that everything simply repeats is linked equally to the notion that everything is subject to change, contrasts with modernist schema of progressive transformation of traditional into futural projection. Modernism combined continuity and rupture in order to secure the horizon of the yet to come, whereas contemporary temporality erases the horizon through which the yet to come might be glimpsed. With the advent of globalism, there was one central slogan, and that is, we live in one world. This one world, though, is a worldless world, or not one world at all. The contemporary describes that space of fracturing whilst insisting on unity, not a dialectical figure that might lead to a third form, but instead a figure constantly collapsing in on itself. Within this, everything appears to be on the move, often at speeds that blind the eye and disorientate sense. Moving at such speed, it might be understood as without movement. It gestures a similar movement as modernity, of reaching beyond itself, but equally collapses back into the realm of emptiness or loss, without cognition of the difference.
That's it.
Do you think it's worldless, Jonathan? It feels like, I mean, you see.
I'm quoting Badiou there.
Oh, right, okay. I think we're all hopeful of that space of hybridity, aren't we? Badiou.
Alan Badiou.
It's
like the text which it reiterates.
I suppose it's something I was just thinking then that, you know, that about those lines about globalism and one world and worldless and so on. It's, you know, we've sort of seen that politically, haven't we? Like with, you know, the likes of Trump and other populists, this sort of desire to actually go back to a more local sense and unpick this, you know, unpick globalization. But I suppose we're in a position where we just can't do that, really. Things are too complicated for us to be able to achieve these sort of political ideals, whether you know, people support them or not.
But I don't know if you say politically or globally. I think the trend politically is going the other way. So the United Kingdom is splitting up because people want more autonomy and more control. You've got some of the European countries wanting to split up, Spain and all of that. So I don't know if the trend really is to one world.
Well, no, I'm not. Well, I think individuals, countries, but you know, like in terms of like under Trump, there was a move towards a more isolationist stance in the world and becoming, you know, stepping back from their position in terms of global power. But, you know, I suppose it's the question is, governments can want to attain these things and people can perhaps, but the reality is that we're so beholden to globalized corporations that it's almost irrelevant because they're still there and they're, you know, they hold as much power, if not more, than a lot of governments.
We're looking now to changing. It's the first time for a long time there's been inflation. The first time the monetarist control of money supply has kind of fractured or become broken. I don't know what the paradigm is at the moment. It's kind of maybe a form of pragmatism. That cycle from around 79 onwards, with the advent of Thatcherism and Reaganism, and money supply economics is definitely coming to an end, or has already ended, and with it is global ideology, and globalism is fractured now. As been said, that we get various tendencies towards nationalism and retreat from, I mean, even China's retreating from globalism.
I really like the work of Vivero de Castro. He's worked with various indigenous tribes in Brazil for several decades, and he describes their approach as as a multiplicity of worlds, that in the West we have or have had an idea that there is one world, one objectively knowable outside world, and a multiplicity of views on that world. But that in this indigenous culture, that's reversed, and you only have your own view, but it's on a multiplicity of worlds. So each person has a relationship to a different world. Then there is no such thing as a one world at all, which I think is a very, interesting idea. So it doesn't, the loss of the idea of one world need not imply that it is worldless. It may just imply that the totalizing concept of a world is what is dying. Not that I see any reflection of that in global politics or economics, but I think it's a very, interesting counterpoint, that perhaps you were just wrong that there was the idea that there was one world in the first place, and again, maybe that's okay, and it doesn't mean that it's worldless. It just means that we each create our own worlds, which in turn becomes more liberating because it gives you even more latitude to create worlds anew.
Well, I think what we see at the moment is the cracks of an illusion that we came to believe that man could, or humans can achieve anything, and reduce space, planet to one point which you can transverse in a second, and there's an infinite supply of everything, and we control everything. And the reality that we actually had before that was a complete false one, that we could overcome all that. But that's just an illusion, which is almost what Jonathan's text seems to be talking about. To me, but I don't think it's real. To me, it's an illusion that it's that illusion that I think we have to overcome. It's deluding. And when Jonathan says that the world is changing, I think we're just seeing the edges of that illusion fall down. I mean, there isn't an infinite supply of things. There aren't these companies who claim they could do anything, can't. And we don't have an infinite amount of money to do whatever we want. It's just that was an illusion, which, if you like, started with Thatcher and Reagan, started to unravel in 2008. It was never real. It was an illusion. I mean, basically, we were bankrupt by 2008 as a consequence of this illusion. And I think COVID just reveals that even we're not immortal either, which was another illusion being put forward, that we can go anywhere and control everything. It's just an illusion, which is put forward because if you believe in that illusion, then it gives power to the illusion. It's self-perpetuating in that sense, but it's cracking all over the place. That's not the real reality that we see now.
So it's all from a perspective as well, isn't it? Like it's from the perspective of the Western canon.
Yeah. I mean, those stories I was talking about were ones that I guess have been proposed in the West. They don't not everyone sees it that way. They're not subject to such a myth, but it is one myth.
Why do you think it's specific to the West?
Well, I'm sorry. Maybe maybe I shouldn't say that. It's specific to a particular philosophy that I guess you could trace back to, say, Descartes, through, where it goes, it follows through modernity. You don't have to be located in the West to have followed that, but it's quite different from, say, a Buddhist philosophy view of thought.
And I wonder how, like, for instance, Jai Chen?
Yeah, I'm Jia. Hi.
Like, so maybe the view of globalism is different from a Chinese perspective, for instance, you know, or we're talking about neoliberalism essentially, aren't we, when we talk about Reagan and Thatcher?
Yeah.
So if we're contextualizing it from the like Western viewpoint.
Yeah, it feels for as a whole, it feels really like very opposite some kind of political stuff. Western with Eastern, very contrary. And I feel this is actually talking about no matter you choose this or that, you are going to be regret and you will find problem with it. And then you know both sides, then or you don't know the both side, but you just follow your cognition, your current cognition, and to make your choice.
I think.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, carry
on. Do you think the sort of like, well, there's, you know, the globalism of the corporations, but there's another globalism as well, perhaps, which is about cultures reaching out to each other. As artists, we're kind of part of that globalization, which is a subtler conversation, I think. And it's a sort of matching, seeing where we meet and match and exchanging ideas without obviously exchanging ideas. I was going somewhere with that and I've slightly lost it, but I think it was about like perspective, you know, perspectives from different standpoints, and whether part of this if there's another layer of globalism, there's nothing, I haven't founded this on any theory or just responding to the text really, but if there's you know, another layer of globalism where it's a sort of about becoming culturally humble across the globe and trying to know each other, you know.
Yeah, I see that Yong Yi Shuan had said something in the chat saying about the Belt and Road initiative by Chinese government and built many infrastructure in Africa, and also some, maybe we call it third world cities. But in another way, in another way, actually for the fiber light, does it called fiber light, the Wi-Fi, this kind of thing, and all the digital world based on some physical element to transmit.
It's not just a continuation of winning the war, you know, winning the cultural war.
Yeah.
Who gets to dominate?
Yeah, so the globalization seems like, in another way, it's also a kind of colonialism, and also it's so hard to say. And also, like in architecture, the modernism is very occupying, and so that Japanese architecture becomes like then find this kind of trend to be very like very, very same kind of like square-ish, like efficient building, and then they started to like emphasize on their culture. But it feels like everyone every city and countries are doing something like back and forth, and to gain more profit for themselves at the moment. And they also based on those cognition of temporary needs of the now for them.
We've also got the establishment of the tendency of great city-states again. It's almost like a feudal situation where city-states dominate the culture. And you get slotted into that, the ubiquity of the same labels, the same businesses, the same circulations within each of those city-states.
Going back to your lecture last week, or talk last week, The End of Time, Hegel effectively argues that in older philosophies there was, or in certain philosophies, there's always the finite being distinct, and that the finite being could never know the infinite, and so there's always something we can never comprehend. It's outside of our ability. What in Hegel did was bring the infinite and finite together within the world. So in other words, his idea was through the progress of time and culture and repeated endless synthesis, the infinite could be understood by man, the human in society, or the philosopher, and he claimed to be that philosopher. He would finally, and at this point, at the end of time, which isn't really the end of time, it's just a repeat of the same, because at that point you understand everything. And we just repeat everything over again. But the point I'm trying to make is that that he instigated the idea that there is such a point, that there is an end to time. And I think this progression that this delusion that we're going somewhere and we're going to globalize and reduce everything to one thing, can be seen as following the path that Hegel set out. And that is not accepting that. That is denying that there is things you can't know. That's effectively saying that we will know, if through the passage and this repeated synthesis, we would come to know everything. That was Hegel's point. And that's quite influential in philosophically and for science as well. It grounded a certain science. And that I guess when you ask me West, I think it's that tradition that we're following here, or that leads that way.
Well, it's a moment of blinding insight. Both blinding and insight come together in one figure.
And that's what I mean by deluded. I would say that he was deluded sitting there. He suddenly believed he could be that person. He's deluded that it even exists.
Mm. Are there any other points? Any other?
This last paragraph is, I don't know, I just screenshotted it because it's one I want to look at a lot later.
I'll just show you a glimpse of the PowerPoint just so that you know what's in it. So if you want to submit it.
I feel there are so many people that they know that they are lack of many cognition, but they just want to stay in that cognition and without knowing all the differences. and all the possibilities, especially in China.
That was a question I have for you, Jaja. Is how is China's relationship to that global picture changed in the last 3 or 4 years with the COVID situation, where it feels like from the West's point of view, we really broke that globalized model of business and travel and this free flow of people and things and ideas. How is the Chinese perspective on it, or is it very difficult to tell how it's changed?
Like this time I went back, I kind of feeling that I don't really know the country because it changes a lot. Like for the COVID situation, actually at first, because it is before the Delta, it is very severe. So the how to say, the way that the government do is actually saving people's life. But later the situation changes and they don't do enough kind of or enough method to make a change, and which makes people very angry about it. But most people are very, very silent, and they just trust the government very much. And this time they start to open the gate again. Before that, there is like a human go on the street, and that actually works. But in China, there's a long time that people never say anything like in the contrary to the government. So I feel this is very, I don't know how can I say that, but there's some problems inside. And I just feel people have power together, but if most people just don't say anything about problems, then the whole society will be like crash. Yeah. And the globalization that Chinese Chinese media is also very centralized. So not most of the people will see both sides, but only people that cultivated with some maybe Western culture or global international views, that they can access something outside of the very centralized point. Then they started to like transmit the ideas from their own social media. So this kind of like self social media had actually changed a lot of Chinese thoughts, but this also based on the technology, and there is like people get used of some sort of stuff, and it just need time to figure out what is the correct way to do that. Like for me personally, I think neither capitalism nor socialism is the perfect ones, but there should be some mix.
Or something completely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, culture cannot be for using as tool of like a weapon or violence, but culture can be a thing that make everyone's life better. That's my point of view. Okay.
Yeah, I started writing some notes yesterday on something which has been, circulating in my head for, I don't know, a long time. And I don't know, for whatever reason, yesterday it just started to come out. And it's a long way from, being something that could be shared at this point. But I definitely do have a perspective on some of this, the things we've been touching on today, which includes a belief or a theory that capitalism is already quite long dead, and that it's just that we haven't realized it yet. And to your point, Gia, it's not about regurgitating the past, and it's not about a left-right political dynamic, because these are all part of the same combative and partisan approaches, which resist an attempt to achieve a consensus. So I don't know. I don't know if I ever find the time to actually develop it, I might share it in this group, because I think I don't know if I've ever encountered anyone else who agrees with me that capitalism died quite a while ago, actually, and it's just that we haven't realized it yet.
You're probably in the wrong sector most of the time to have that discussion.
No, I'm going to tell you what, if I go into banking, believe me, nobody there believes it's dead. Nobody anywhere believes it's dead. The effects are very real still, because we believe it not to be dead. So it's not to say that it's, even if it's zombie capitalism, it still has a lot of power. So it's not to underestimate that, but it is. I think it's a very different point of view, which is that that has already happened. In fact, it happened quite some time ago. It's just we haven't caught up yet, and that I guess, as I was saying earlier, it's more about embracing that than anything else at this point, and transcending it. So. Yeah, maybe if I ever find the time to actually turn it into something that's legible to anybody else other than me, then I might share it.
I mean, it seems to the Derrida spectres of Marx is a similar structure where something continues, but it continues as spectre.
Mm. Mm.
That finishes a half-life or a spectral life, which is where you get then the idea of zombie capitalism.
Mm. Mm.
But also, I mean, also in socialism, people are like zombie as well.
Yeah, exactly. But it's all the same. It's all the same. It's pitted as different, but it isn't. It's all part. The entire left and the right is encompassed within a certain way of thinking. Yeah. And I've long believed that is something we need to get beyond. Yeah.
I mean, you've just got political dictatorships. Full stop. Modi. Putin,
self-awareness.
Just.
You can call things socialism or capitalism, but unless they actually are that, I'm not sure if we can judge the systems. And I would think that it's quite rare that socialist systems quite often end up being hijacked really by personal gain, and that's not the philosophy behind them. I think we'll see that in Russia first.
What is USSR?
The former Russia, United.
It was United Soviet Socialist Republics. It was Russia, Ukraine, all the stands really, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, etc., Romania, they're a big group, a big bloc.
Yeah. Yeah,
without going too much into this, let me just add one thing. This has been a continuous debate among my family members and friends as well. Socialism and capitalism and communism is basically economic system. And then we have democracy and totalitarian, which is basically political system. These days, they all seem to be going together and mixed. So what I'm trying to say is that still this individualism, democracy, and capitalism seem to be the working system, as we've seen in breakdown of Soviet Union, all those individual countries now on their own. And China built on communism, but now actually picking a lot of capitalism models. So when we see actually what is happening around us, that's what I'm saying. It still prevails, but with a lot of problems that we all have to deal with.
Yeah.
That's what is that.
Yeah, and undoubtedly it does prevail, at least for now. But it's, I think, also true that it died already, and that therefore it inevitably will come to a close, even though that might take a long time because it is already dead. And when you think about, the left-right spectrum of what do I mean by dead? I mean all systems, all ideas have an arc. They have a life cycle. And we love the idea that we've achieved the final answer and it will go on and on and on, and we've achieved sustainability and we've beaten we've beaten death. But that's just a bedtime story. It's not true. Do
you mean
and that capitalism has reached the point where the motivation to preserve accumulated advantage exceeds the motivation to further change and innovation. And capitalism, which is, predicated on that and on a meritocracy, if it has reached the tipping point where it is more inclined to protect its accumulated advantage than to continue to renew itself, then that is what I mean by dead. And so energetically, no, I just mean it's dead. Energetically, morally, it's dead. On its very own principles, it's dead. But there's a huge difference between all things have a life cycle. I don't mean it's alive as in a human being. I mean it has a life cycle. All systems do. Everything that is, every complex system has a life cycle. And one of the characteristics of a complex system is that there are, very, very long time lags. So they can be decades, if not hundreds of years between cause and effect. And so whilst the cause has already happened, in my view, because capitalism has died on its own meritocracy principles at this point, so therefore it is morally, conceptually expired on its own basis.
I wouldn't agree that.
But it might take decades, if not longer, before the effect of that is actually realized or appreciated.
Are you saying like it's dead in the way that like somebody says you're a dead man because they've done something wrong and they're going to go and kill them? Because capitalism is alive. I mean, you might...
It's alive in our consciousness, but it's dead on its own principles. Yeah, it's alive because we continue to breathe life into it, but not because it is alive anymore.
I don't breathe life into capitalism. No, believing in like...
By just believing that it is the still prevailing, that in itself breathes life into it.
Oh, like I just law of attraction by
capitalism isn't predicated on meritocracy, and it never has been. That's a complete illusion or delusion. It's you know, very few people in positions of power are there on merit. They're there from various different situations, but often it's from being born into existing advantage, and just happening to have the opportunity.
Yes, but
I don't think there's very little meritocracy as I see it in capitalism.
No, absolutely, and that's part of the late stages of capitalism where it is, but it is absolutely the basis that it was sold upon, because it replaced an idea that that class
you're talking about neoliberalism.
Was based on.
You're talking about neoliberalism, not capitalism.
No, I'm actually talking about both, but specifically about capitalism.
Capitalism, I think, is a symptom of neoliberalism.
How about Jonathan?
One is more political and one is more economic. So they're a little bit different, but they tend to go together.
I do think this debate can go on for another hour or two, or even overnight if we are all having a glass of wine in our hands. However, Jonathan, second thing you had was on history, and we are talking about data and all the others, and I thought that's actually a good link to the books that I was reading. Plus, last time I remember you also suggested at some point, perhaps we can have, if anybody have a little presentation on this topic of history sort of thing. So I had a very simple PowerPoint, if it's okay with everybody.
Yeah, you show it.
Yeah, go for it.
Let's see. Everyone seeing okay?
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Okay. So these are the three books that I've read. These are all published within last 10 years or so. You might recall last time I mentioned briefly, these books are more for economic, political, social perspective, not so much of art history or philosophical. But let me share a few things out of here. Basically, what he said was simple recount of agricultural liberation and scientific liberation. We talk about it slightly briefly today, and then the technological development. And then, hang on. My computer is stuck. I cannot get into second. So let me just do this. So simple summary is that I'm still reading the third book, but basically in the future, it's algorithm and dataism. People believe in data and AI. Basically, he was saying now humans are going into the homo deus in the level of state of God, actually, creating and modifying life, etc. It's very sober, but also believe that art goes with the society and what's happening, like a war and economy and politics. We can't be separate from what is happening. So just providing option of looking at the things in macro level. I just wanted to share with it. And also, as I mentioned, Jonathan, the second writing on history, start to talk about dataism, and I think it's really relevant because even in art, we are looking at AIs and NFTs and all this virtual reality art, quite dominant at Venice Biennale, for example. Last two Venice Biennale that I attended last year and 3 years ago. Quite a lot of art are in that form, for example. And I think we should need to be mindful and also aware of what's the other one. Also want to add one more thing. Have anybody read this book?
I know of it.
Been sitting on my bookshelf for years, maybe one day.
Yeah, it's again similar to what it says, that human beings' algorithm and the mind or soul is nothing but like a neurological system or chemical or hormone reaction thing. This book is a compilation of the cases. People have this neurological disorder, and basically they lost soul, they lost the mind, they lost identity or personality sort of thing. Quite interesting, fascinating, different perspective. There, I think I very successfully changed the direction of our discussion slightly out of capitalism and democracy and all that. But in a bigger context, I think they are all linked. Thanks, Jonathan. Allowing me.
It's interesting talking about, like the idea of data and stuff. It sort of took me back to, I was reading Gaia Theory by James Lovelock just for Christmas, and he makes the point in it, like and it's something I'd never thought about before. We're the only species that can transmit and store data. That's really what sort of defines us from animals. It's not sort of intelligence per se or levels of it. It's the fact that we can abstract and do all this kind of stuff. And it's sort of, maybe that's kind of one of the things that's happening now, is we're kind of beginning to reach our own threshold or tolerance of data. Because there's something about, the internet as a kind of concept is just so unfathomably vast. I remember Michael Haneke for years was supposedly working on this film about the internet, and he sort of gave up on it. And you think if someone of that sort of stature and he does incredible films about the human condition, or like can't kind of fathom it. It's sort of, maybe that's kind of one of the significant things that really is going on, is this we're all aware of data. We all hear these terms, big data, which is bandied around, all sort of financial industries and advertising, all these kind of things, but it does, none of it really makes any sense, and it can never make sense to us. It's like I always forget what it's called. There was that water model in the 60s that can basically demonstrate a Western economy. It's quite a kind of beautiful machine, but it couldn't even come close nowadays. There's no diagram, there's no thing that we can show to demonstrate how an economy works anymore. It's just too complicated to even comprehend.
Jessica, you have to hurry up and write your paper and your presentation for us.
I know.
You've got a willing audience here.
Oh,
Yeah.
another thing that I also like to add, going back to the discussion we had, I had my little thing on the books. Going back to Blake's comment on meritocracy. I would like to actually throw in for the discussion, US is a system built in meritocracy. A couple of 100 years ago, when people left Europe and went to US, that country was built on ideas and idealism and all these founding fathers. And there really is its own East Coast white Anglo-Saxon. They built Harvard, and whoever went to Yale and who is playing what sort of game, Princeton, those all start to build on their own social structure in a way. But UK has thousands of years of those people born with the titles and money. US, they didn't have that. So that was the what's it called, Brave New World, and where people went to US chasing their American dream, my father being one of those. But when I was in the States, I could really feel that this is area that people come with nothing from Mexico, wherever, but work hard and then build on. And even in UK, we have Sunak. Wasn't his family another example of coming from somewhere and then build on? So just to throw in the ring of discussion, that I do believe some countries and society are built on meritocracy. And I think that's what I'd go back to, that human desire and greed of building something better for me, better for my children. I believe that's the power behind this capitalism or even democracy. Democracy works better for me and better for my children. But again, just an idea to throw in the ring.
We're just stepping back a little bit. What do we imagine the discussion is of the culture? How do you organize a forum around the culture?
So what do you mean, Jonathan?
How do you discuss the culture that you're in? What mechanisms do you employ? I mean, before, there was, let's say, art history was the medium by which you discuss a modernity and a place within modernity, and it seemed to fall into place where you were, what was at stake, what moves to make. It was a fairly centralized discussion. There was only so much happening at a given time. Only so many different movements and programs. Seems it's disappeared, that sort of sense of, and it's obvious why it's disappeared.
Why?
I mean, art history has disappeared.
But why? You said it's obvious why.
Because there's so many multifaceted things which are going off. I mean, they decided that, suddenly there was you go to the Tate Gallery and they just changed the whole schema of what the contemporary is. They suddenly decide that they've got to privilege other cultures, black artists, different discourses in art. It's all over the place. No controlling narrative. I'm not saying there should be. But if you'd walked around the Tate Gallery 5 years ago and walk around it now, there seems to be immense labor of collecting new forms of art and new ways of presentation. But there's not particularly a narrative to do with that. Just the suggestion that there's various discourses of decolonization and feminism and so forth, so ideologies of movements.
The decolonization is like the taking away of the position of the
privilege. So, in other words, the critique of modernity was essentially a white Anglo-American male centered privileged discourse.
Yeah, so how do we, with so many points of view, how do we take a view?
What I'm saying is, how do you discuss the prevailing winds, as it were? I mean, within art school, how do you organize a theoretical discussion about anything? Do you just abandon it?
You mean abandon the Western art history?
Hmm?
You mean abandon Western art history?
Well, the model of art history is abandoned.
Sort of.
Yeah.
I think it's more like it becomes one of the trends, but the trend starts to like grow with many, many roads.
Yeah, but in order for art history to be relevant, or even the contemporary art history to be relevant, it has to be relevant.
It would be relevant.
Current world, otherwise it will die. It won't be of interest. So it's not guaranteed it's interest, all of it, but some of it would be relevant. I mean, so.
I was also in a Chinese art background. I was in a art high school in China, and then I go to America for my BA. So I've actually like learned different cultures, and in China we also learn Western art history, but we also have another subject is to learn Chinese art history. And then there are two trends that we learn from, but we definitely have influence from those old Western, maybe male-gazed art history from there. But from there, we also criticize it. And also in America, we also criticize it. And then have new trends. Maybe for now, America has they also have kind of like a how do you say, political correctness for certain kind of theme. It feels like a trend of America. It's not like America is totally very liberal. And I have a friend from Japan. She also studied Western art history and also Japanese art history, and she also go to America for study, and she now live in London as a emerging artist, and she feel kind of like she used to feel that America is a lot more liberal, but for now she think London becomes more liberal for artists. That's what she told me this time I'm back.
So back to your question, Jonathan, about where do you discuss the culture? How do you structure that? It has to be through storytelling, surely, and maybe we have lost that linear narrative of art history in the institutions. I also heard something talking about sort of Hollywood sort of imploding as well, in a way, with all of these great big films at the moment of sort of like big celebration of sort of Hollywood that was, and goodbye to Hollywood kind of thing with Steven Spielberg and these films that are coming out. And so the question is, where are we storytelling? Are we storytelling through our work? Where are we telling these stories?
Yes, so in other words, what do we do? Which is kind of leads to a sort of a structure whereby we can not necessarily follow it, but have a sense of a project.
Gather
we come together out of a desire to be together and to discuss. But it's not just what we discuss, it's how we discuss it.
But is another approach, Jonathan, to your question, to do it in a comparative way? So, looking at how you perceive your own culture, or comparing aspects of what you think you perceive relative to other times or other places. But I don't know how you avoid the blind spots with that.
Maybe it's just a sort of stepping down from the the word, there is a word for it, but the kind of the arrogance of the absolute knower of the subject. And maybe this is just a moment where there's a stepping down from that. And then we'll be able to take up positions again. Did I interrupt your flow, Lester?
No. I think we could start with, next week is going to be interesting. We're in a space together. And the proposition that it's going to be candlelit. And maybe it's a different sort of, no computers, just being in a space together.
Can we, I guess, Yoni, will you come remotely? We can have you on a screen.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Yoni can come on a screen.
Yeah.
If technology allows, yes, just one of you can have a smartphone, etc. I'll be happy to just listen and be a part of it. One thing.
Well, we have one computer. Yeah. We have a computer.
Yeah.
As long as you have a candle in your room.
Lots of those, yes. But that's, again, pluses and minuses of this day, what's the present day and age, whatever. We do have a technology available, so why not use it? But I think it's wonderful that you guys have opportunity to get together. I still believe in that, having physical presence, and nothing really beats it.
Yeah, we can sort it out.
I missed Anna's invitation last week. What did she invite us for to do?
Go to her studio and sit in the candlelit.
Brilliant.
And the candlelight.
Yeah.
And work it out.
Great.
Well, in-person conversation's so radically different. There's something, very difficult about online calls and all that.
We were saying that today when we met up, actually. There's just a much easier way of, easier flow of discussion and talking, sharing.
Yeah, it is. It's a lot chill. Chill. Sorry. Chill.
Guys, I'm really sorry I have to go. Is there anything we have to bring if we come next week?
The candle.
Maybe a candle.
A story.
A story.
A story is a good one.
We could bring stories.
Stories, okay.
And we could just not plan a sort of theme, but just see what happens. Just handle it and
Chat.
get a handle on it.
And what day is she doing it?
Monday.
Oh, okay. It's in place of this session. What, 6 o'clock?
6 till 8 in my new studio.
Well, is she still Mayfair? Is that right?
Yes, Mayfair, so it's central. Bond Street. Bond Street Tube, just 5 minutes away, 2 or 3 minutes away.
And there could be a team dinner at Aubergine afterwards.
It's at Claridge's.
Let's do it.
Have we still got the budget? We haven't spent it yet.
We've got £50 each to spend on afterwards.
Thank God capitalism.
Everybody bring their sequins.
Bring a story.
Yeah.
It could be idiosyncratic. It could be.
And I also have a writing about the history.
Well, make it into a story and share it.
It's also about stories.
Stories.
History
Not
is
everybody likes stories.
history is a story. Go on, you go for it.
Sorry, guys, I'm really sorry. I have to go. I'll see you next week. I hope.
bye.
Bye, Marley.
Bye. Thank
Bye,
you.
Mai.
Bye.
Go for it.
History, high story. History, past events. High story, say hello to an account of imaginary or real people and events. His Tory, the person supporter of the Conservative Party. His Tory, stop relating